The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guardsman Thomas Whitmore took his position outside the iconic black iron gates. At 24 years old, Thomas had served in the Grenadier Guards for 3 years. But standing ceremonial duty at the palace still filled him with a sense of pride and responsibility that never faded. The red tunic felt heavy in the summer heat, and the towering bearskin hat added another pound of weight to his already rigid posture. But Thomas stood perfectly still, his expression blank, his eyes fixed straight ahead. This was what tourists came to see. The stoic, unmoving guards in their brilliant red uniforms and massive black fur hats, standing like statues regardless of weather, noise, or distraction. It was a tradition dating back centuries, a symbol of British discipline and the unwavering protection of the monarchy. Thomas had trained for months to perfect the art of remaining motionless, of ignoring provocations, of maintaining the image of the perfect ceremonial guard. Around him, hundreds of tourists gathered behind the gates, cameras clicking constantly. Phones held high to capture videos and selfies with the famous guards. Thomas was used to the attention. He'd learned to tune out the voices, the laughter, the occasional shouts trying to make him react. Most tourists were respectful, keeping their distance and simply admiring the pageantry. But there were always a few who crossed the line. Thomas had seen it all during his time on palace duty. Tourists who tried to touch the guards, who made faces inches from their noses, who asked ridiculous questions expecting answers, who posed for inappropriate photos. The guards had strict orders not to react unless someone posed a genuine threat or crossed into restricted areas. Minor annoyances were to be endured with silent dignity. Standing next to Thomas was Guardsman Peter Chen, a friend from basic training who had joined the guards at the same time. Peter was better at the stoic routine than Thomas, able to zone out completely and enter an almost meditative state during the long hours of duty. Thomas envied that ability. His mind always remained active, aware of everything happening around him, cataloging faces and voices and potential problems. The morning had been relatively quiet. The usual stream of tourists, a few school groups with excited children, some elderly couples who remembered when palace guards were a common sight throughout London. Thomas's feet ached in his polished black boots. Sweat trickled down his back under the thick wool uniform, but his expression never changed. This was the job. This was the honor. Around 11 o'clock, Thomas noticed a group of young men approaching the gates. There were 5 of them, probably in their early 20s, wearing expensive designer clothes and carrying an attitude of entitled confidence. Thomas recognized the type immediately. Wealthy tourists, probably American or European, who viewed the ceremonial guards as entertainment rather than soldiers worthy of respect. The group stopped directly in front of Thomas, and he could hear them talking loudly among themselves, their voices carrying that particular tone of people who were used to being the center of attention wherever they went. One of them, a tall blonde man with an expensive watch and designer sunglasses, pulled out his phone and started recording video. Check it out. "We're at Buckingham Palace," the blonde man said to his phone, panning the camera across the ornate gates and the guards standing at attention. "Let's see if we can get one of these toy soldiers to react." Thomas felt a flicker of irritation but pushed it down. He'd heard worse. The key was not to react, not to give them what they wanted. His commanding officer's words echoed in his mind. "You are representing the Queen, the military, and the nation. Your discipline reflects on all of us." The blonde man walked closer, stopping just a foot away from Thomas. The phone camera was pointed directly at his face. "Hey buddy, you awake in there? Can you hear me?" Thomas stared straight ahead, his eyes focused on the middle distance, seeing everything but acknowledging nothing. His breathing remained steady and controlled. The blonde man waved his hand in front of Thomas's face. "I don't think he's real," one of the other men laughed. "Maybe he's a robot or something." The blonde man turned back to his friends, grinning. "Watch this." He moved even closer, now inches from Thomas's face, and started making exaggerated expressions, crossing his eyes, sticking out his tongue, contorting his features into ridiculous faces. His friends laughed and encouraged him, recording their own videos of the spectacle. Thomas remained perfectly still. He'd dealt with this kind of behavior before. Usually, When tourists realized they couldn't get a reaction, they would get bored and move on. But this group seemed determined to push further. The blond man reached into his pocket and pulled out a banana. He peeled it slowly, theatrically, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Then he took a bite and chewed it right in front of Thomas, making exaggerated eating sounds. His friends howled with laughter. "Dude, you're hilarious," one of them shouted. "See if you can make him smile?" Other tourists were starting to notice the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable with the young men's behavior, while others pulled out their own phones to record the interaction. A crowd was forming, and Thomas could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. This was becoming a situation. The blond man finished the banana and looked around, clearly thinking about what to do next. His eyes fell on the ceremonial sentry box behind Thomas, the small wooden structure where guards could shelter during particularly harsh weather. An idea seemed to form in his mind, and his grin widened. "I bet I can get inside that little house," he said to his friends. "Wouldn't that make a great video? Me chilling in the guard's house while he just stands there?" Thomas felt his jaw tighten imperceptibly. The sentry boxes were off limits to the public. Actually entering one would constitute a clear violation of the restricted area. That would require a response. The blond man took a step toward the sentry box, and Thomas prepared to move if necessary. But before the situation could escalate further, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Oh, you lot. Step back from the guard." A palace police officer was striding toward the group, his hand resting on his radio. The officer was in his 40s, the weathered look of someone who had dealt with tourists for many years and had lost all his patience for nonsense. The blond man turned, his expression shifting from amused to annoyed. "We're just having a bit of fun, officer. No harm done." "Step away from the guard in the sentry box," the officer repeated, his voice firm. "You're disrupting official duties and harassing military personnel." One of the other young men stepped forward, his voice challenging. "Harassing? We're just taking pictures. It's a public space. We have rights." Officer's expression hardened. "This is royal property, and these guards are on active duty protecting the monarch. You will show respect, or you will be removed. Your choice." The group exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. The blond man looked like he wanted to argue, his jaw set stubbornly. But before he could speak, something happened that changed everything. A young woman, maybe 16 or 17 years old, approached the group. She was dressed simply in jeans and a jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked nervous but determined as she addressed the blond man. "Excuse me," she said, her British accent clear. "Could you please leave the guard alone? My brother serves in the military, and it's really disrespectful what you're doing." The blond man turned to her, his expression shifting to something uglier. "Mind your own business, sweetheart. We're just having fun." "It's not fun for him," the young woman insisted, gesturing toward Thomas. "He's doing his job, and you're making a mockery of it." The blond man's friend laughed. "Oh, we got ourselves a little patriot here. What are you, his girlfriend? You want to stand next to him and be a statue too?" The young woman's face flushed, but she held her ground. "I'm just asking you to show some respect. These guards are real soldiers. They've served in combat. They deserve better than this." The blond man stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "Listen, little girl, maybe you should worry about yourself instead of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Thomas felt something shift inside him. He'd maintained his composure through the mockery and disrespect directed at himself. That was part of the job. But watching this young woman being intimidated for trying to defend him was different. She was showing more courage and honor than the 5 grown men combined, and she was being threatened for it. The palace police officer moved toward the group. But before he could intervene, the blond man made a critical mistake. He reached out and shoved the young woman's shoulder, not hard enough to hurt her, but enough to make her stumble backward. "I said mind your business," he sneered. That was the line. Thomas had been trained to ignore personal provocations, but physical contact with a civilian, especially a minor, especially in an act of aggression, changed everything. His duty to protect extended beyond just the palace grounds, in one fluid motion. Thomas stepped forward from his post, his right hand moving to the SA-80 rifle he carried. The movement was sharp, precise, and utterly unexpected. The blond man turned just in time to see Thomas moving toward him, the bayonet fixed to the rifle glinting in the sunlight. "Make way for the Queen's Guard," Thomas roared, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the full force of military command. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The blond man and his friends stumbled backward, their faces transforming from smug amusement to shock and genuine fear. The crowd of tourists gasped and scattered, creating space around the confrontation. Phones that had been recording the harassment were now capturing something entirely different. A ceremonial guard breaking from his post to confront disrespectful tourists. Thomas took 2 more steps forward, his boots striking the ground with precise military cadence. His face, which had been blank and expressionless for hours, was now a mask of controlled fury. His eyes, which had been staring at nothing, were now locked onto the blond man with an intensity that made the tourist shrink backward. "Step away from the civilian," Thomas commanded, his voice like iron, "and clear the area immediately." The palace police officer was beside Thomas now, his radio already calling for backup. But the situation was already resolving itself. The 5 young men were backing away rapidly, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The blond man held up his hands in a placating gesture. "We were just joking around, mate. No need to get upset." "You assaulted a minor on palace grounds," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. "That is not a joke." The young woman was standing to the side, her eyes wide with surprise but also with gratitude. Other tourists in the crowd were murmuring their approval, some actually clapping at seeing the disrespectful group finally facing consequences for their behavior. Within minutes, additional palace security arrived, along with 2 more guards to relieve Thomas and Peter. The 5 young men were detained for questioning, their phones confiscated as evidence. The blond man's face had gone pale as he realized the seriousness of the situation. What had started as a fun video for social media was now likely to result in criminal charges. Thomas returned to his post, resuming his rigid stance, his face once again becoming the expressionless mask of a ceremonial guard. But inside, his heart was still pounding, adrenaline still coursing through his system. He'd broken protocol by reacting. He'd abandoned his post to intervene in a situation. His commanding officers would need to be informed, and there would be questions. But as he stood there, returning to his duty, Thomas noticed the young woman was still nearby. She caught his eye for just a moment, and she smiled, mouthing the words, "Thank you." Then she disappeared into the crowd. Thomas stared straight ahead, but for the first time in his 3 years of ceremonial duty, he felt like he'd done something that truly mattered. He'd defended not just the dignity of the guards, but someone who had tried to defend him. And whatever consequences came from breaking protocol, he knew he'd made the right choice. What Thomas didn't know was that dozens of phones had captured the entire incident. Videos were already being uploaded to social media, spreading across the internet at viral speed. By evening, millions of people would watch the moment when a Queen's Guard broke his legendary stillness to confront disrespect. The incident would spark debates about tourism, respect, and the treatment of ceremonial guards. But that was all to come. For now, Thomas simply stood at his post, the summer sun warming his red tunic, and waited for his relief to arrive. By the time Thomas Whitmore finished his shift at Buckingham Palace that afternoon, he had no idea that his brief confrontation with the disrespectful tourists had become an international sensation. He marched back to the guardhouse with Peter Chen and the other members of his unit, relieved to finally remove the heavy bearskin hat and step out of the sweltering red tunic. His commanding officer, Captain James Morrison, was waiting for them in the briefing room, his expression serious but unreadable. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. He knew this moment was coming. Breaking from his post, even for a legitimate reason, required an explanation and likely some form of disciplinary action. The British military took ceremonial duties seriously, and the guards were held to the highest standards of discipline and protocol. "Guardsman Whitmore," Captain Morrison said as Thomas entered the room. "A word in my office, please." Thomas followed his commanding officer down the hallway, his mind racing through the incident, reviewing every decision he'd made. He'd acted to protect a civilian who had been physically assaulted. That was justifiable. But he'd also abandoned his post and created a spectacle that drew attention away from the ceremonial nature of palace duty. The line between right action and breach of protocol felt uncomfortably thin. Captain Morrison closed the office door and gestured for Thomas to sit. The older officer settled behind his desk, pulling up something on his computer screen. "I've received several reports about an incident at the palace gates this morning. Palace security, the Metropolitan Police, and about 24 tourist witnesses have all provided statements. Before we discuss the disciplinary aspects, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened from your perspective." Thomas took a breath and recounted the morning's events in detail. The group of young men harassing him, the mockery and disrespect, the young woman who intervened on his behalf, and finally the physical contact that prompted his response. He spoke clearly and factually, taking responsibility for his actions while explaining his reasoning. Captain Morrison listened without interrupting. His fingers steepled under his chin. When Thomas finished, the officer nodded slowly. "You understand that abandoning your post and engaging with civilians violates several protocols we've established for ceremonial duties?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." "Good. Now let me show you something." Morrison turned his computer screen toward Thomas. On the display was a video, clearly recorded on a phone, showing the entire incident from beginning to end. Thomas watched himself standing motionless as the blond man harassed him, saw the young woman's intervention, witnessed the shove, and then saw his own explosive reaction. The video had already been viewed over 2 million times. The comment section was scrolling by rapidly, filled with reactions from people all over the world. Thomas felt a sense of surreal disconnection watching himself on screen. Seeing the incident from an outside perspective, "This video," Morrison said, along with about 40 others showing the same incident from different angles, "has been shared across every major social media platform: YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. It's gone viral, as the kids say. The media outlets are already running stories. Royal Guard breaks silence to defend a young woman. Tourist faces charges after disrespecting Buckingham Palace Guard. The headlines are everywhere." Thomas stared at the screen, watching the view count tick upward. "Sir, I didn't mean to create a media situation. I was simply responding to a threat against a civilian." Morrison's stern expression finally cracked, revealing something that might have been a smile. "Thomas, you're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. The palace press office has been fielding calls all morning, and the response from the public has been overwhelmingly positive. People are praising your restraint, your discipline, and your decision to intervene when someone was assaulted. The young woman you defended has given an interview to the BBC, describing how you protected her when those tourists became aggressive." Thomas felt relief flooding through him, but also a strange sense of discomfort. "With respect, sir, I was just doing what any guard would do. It wasn't anything special." "That's where you're wrong," Morrison said, leaning back in his chair. "What you did was demonstrate the difference between ceremonial duty and actual duty. Yes, we stand still and ignore provocations. Yes, we're supposed to be living statues for tourists to photograph. But underneath that uniform, we're still soldiers. We're still protectors. You reminded everyone of that fact, and you did it in a way that's captured global attention." The captain pulled up another web page, this one showing a news article from an American publication. The headline read, "British Royal Guard goes viral after defending teen from aggressive tourists." The article included interviews with witnesses, analysis of the Guard's role and responsibilities, and commentary from military experts about the appropriateness of Thomas's response. "The American tourist who shoved the young woman has been charged with assault," Morrison continued. "His friends are facing charges related to harassment and disturbing the peace. The videos provide clear evidence of their behavior, and the Metropolitan Police are treating this seriously. The palace wants to make it clear that while we tolerate a certain amount of tourist enthusiasm, harassment of guards and assault of civilians will not be accepted." Thomas absorbed this information, still trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. A simple moment of standing up for what was right had somehow become an international news story. "What happens now, sir?" Morrison closed his computer and looked directly at Thomas. "Now you become the face of an important message. The palace communications office wants to use this incident to educate the public about the proper way to interact with ceremonial guards. They're developing new signage, updating their website, and creating social media content about respecting the guards. And they'd like you to participate in a press conference tomorrow morning. Thomas felt his stomach drop. A press conference? Sir, I'm not good with that sort of thing. I'm a soldier, not a spokesperson. You'll have full support from the palace press team, Morrison assured him. They'll brief you on what to say, how to handle questions, and how to convey the message they want to share. This is an opportunity to do something important for the guards, Thomas. The harassment we face daily from tourists has been getting worse over the years. This incident has created a moment where we can actually address it publicly and hopefully create some change. Thomas nodded reluctantly. He understood the importance of what the captain was saying. The idea of facing cameras and reporters made him far more nervous than standing on ceremonial duty ever did. I'll do my best, sir. I know you will. Now, you're dismissed for the rest of the day. Go home, get some rest, and report to the palace press office at 0800 tomorrow morning. And Thomas? Morrison's expression softened. What you did today was the right thing. Never doubt that. Thomas left the guardhouse and headed for the tube station. Still wearing his civilian clothes, his military duffel bag slung over his shoulder. As he walked through London's crowded streets, he noticed people looking at their phones, some pointing and whispering to friends. At first, he thought he was being paranoid, but then he overheard a conversation between two teenage girls. That's so crazy about that guard video, one was saying. I can't believe those tourists were such jerks. I know, right? But that guard was amazing. Did you see how fast he moved? And his voice, when he shouted, was so intense. Thomas kept his head down and walked faster. The idea that strangers were discussing him, that millions of people had watched that moment, felt deeply uncomfortable. He'd joined the military to serve, not to become a viral sensation. When he finally arrived at his small flat in South London, Thomas collapsed on his sofa and pulled out his own phone. He'd been avoiding social media all day, but curiosity finally got the better of him. He searched for Buckingham Palace Guard and was immediately overwhelmed by the results. The video was everywhere. News websites, social media platforms, even international outlets in languages Thomas didn't speak. The comments numbered in the tens of thousands, with people from around the world weighing in on the incident. Most were supportive, praising his restraint and his decision to intervene. But there were critics too, people who argued he'd overreacted or that the tourists were just having harmless fun. One comment thread caught his attention. Someone had identified the young woman who had tried to defend him. Her name was Emma Richardson, and she was a 17-year-old student from Manchester visiting London on a school trip. She'd given an interview to several news outlets describing the incident from her perspective. Thomas found the BBC interview and watched it. Emma sat in a studio, looking nervous but determined, as the interviewer asked about what had happened. I just thought it was wrong, Emma explained. These tourists were treating the guard like he wasn't a real person, like he was just a prop for their entertainment. My brother is in the army, deployed overseas, and I know what it's like for military families. These guards deserve respect, not mockery. The interviewer asked about the moment when the blonde man shoved her. Emma's expression hardened. I was scared, honestly. These were grown men, and they were getting aggressive. But then the guard moved, and I felt safe immediately. He didn't hurt anyone or lose control. He just made it clear that what they were doing wasn't acceptable. He protected me, and I'm grateful. Thomas felt a lump forming in his throat as he watched Emma defend him to the media. This young woman, barely out of childhood, had shown more courage and integrity than the 5 adult tourists combined. She'd risked confrontation to stand up for what was right, and when things got dangerous, he'd been able to protect her. Maybe that was what military service was really about. Not the ceremonies or the traditions, but the willingness to defend those who needed defending. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. Just saw the news. Are you okay? Call me when you can. Very proud of you. Love, Mum. Thomas smiled and called her immediately. His mother answered on the first ring, her voice a mixture of concern and pride. For the next hour, he talked with his parents, explaining what had happened and assuring them he wasn't in any trouble. His father, a retired policeman, understood immediately why Thomas had acted as he did. "You did the right thing, son," his father said firmly. "Doesn't matter what anyone says. You saw someone being harassed and then assaulted, and you intervened. That's what good men do." After hanging up with his parents, Thomas tried to relax, but sleep was impossible. His mind kept replaying the incident, analyzing his decisions, wondering what the press conference would be like tomorrow. Around midnight, he finally dozed off, his dreams filled with flashing cameras and shouting tourists. The next morning, Thomas arrived at Buckingham Palace at exactly 0800, wearing his dress uniform. He was escorted to the press office by a young woman named Claire, who worked in palace communications. She was friendly and professional, immediately putting Thomas at ease as she explained the format of the press conference. "We'll have about 20 journalists present, representing major UK outlets and some international media," Claire explained as she led Thomas through the ornate palace hallways. "You'll be seated at a table with Captain Morrison and a representative from the palace. We'll start with a prepared statement, then open it up for questions. Just speak honestly and stay focused on the key messages. Respect for the guards, the seriousness with which we take harassment and assault, and the importance of remembering that ceremonial guards are active duty soldiers." Thomas nodded, his mouth dry. They entered a large room that had been set up for the press conference, with rows of chairs facing a table at the front. Cameras on tripods lined the back wall, and journalists were already taking their seats, chatting among themselves. The sight of so many reporters made Thomas's heart race. Captain Morrison was already seated at the table, and he gave Thomas an encouraging nod as he sat down. The palace representative, an older gentleman named Sir Charles Wexford, introduced himself and reviewed the key points one final time. At exactly 9 o'clock, the press conference began. Sir Charles delivered the opening statement describing the incident, the charges being filed against the tourists, and the palace's commitment to protecting both the guards and visitors who behaved respectfully. Then he introduced Thomas. "Guardsman Whitmore has agreed to speak with you today about his experience and about the broader issue of respect for ceremonial guards. Please direct your questions to him." Immediately, hands shot up around the room. Sir Charles pointed to a reporter from the Times who stood up with her notepad ready. "Guardsman Whitmore, can you tell us what was going through your mind when you decided to break from your post?" Thomas leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I didn't really think about it as a decision, ma'am. I'd been trained to remain still and ignore provocations directed at me personally. But when I saw a young woman being physically assaulted for trying to defend me, that crossed a line. My duty is to protect people, and that duty doesn't stop just because I'm in ceremonial uniform." Another reporter, this one from the BBC, asked the next question. "Some people online have criticized you for overreacting to what they claim was just playful tourist behavior. How do you respond to that?" Thomas considered his words carefully. "I'd say there's a difference between playful enthusiasm and deliberate disrespect. Taking photos with the guards, asking questions, even trying to make us smile, that's all part of the tourist experience. But sustained harassment, mockery, and especially physical contact crosses into territory that we can't and won't tolerate. The young men involved weren't being playful. They were being deliberately cruel, and it escalated to assault." The questions continued for over an hour. Reporters asked about his training, his background, his thoughts on viral fame, and his hopes for how tourists would behave in the future. Thomas answered each question honestly and thoughtfully, finding his confidence growing as the press conference progressed. Finally, a reporter from an American news network asked the question that tied everything together. "Guardsman Whitmore, your response to this incident has resonated with millions of people around the world. Why do you think that is?" Thomas paused, gathering his thoughts. "I think people understand that respect matters. These uniforms, these traditions, they represent something bigger than just tourism or pageantry. They represent centuries of service and sacrifice. When you disrespect a guard, you're not just bothering one soldier. You're diminishing all the people who've worn this uniform, including those who've given their lives in service. I think people recognize that, and they appreciate seeing that respect defended." As the press conference concluded and the journalists filed out, Thomas felt drained, but also satisfied. He'd represented the guards well, delivered the message the palace wanted to share, and done so with dignity. Whatever came next, he'd face this challenge and emerged intact. What Thomas didn't realize was that his words at the press conference would be quoted in news articles around the world, further cementing his status as an unlikely spokesman for respect and tradition. The incident that had begun with simple harassment at palace gates had transformed into a global conversation about how we treat those who serve. And somewhere in Manchester, Emma Richardson watched the press conference on her laptop, tears streaming down her face, proud that her small act of courage had led to something so much bigger. 3 days after the press conference, Thomas Whitmore returned to regular ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace, hoping that life would return to normal. He should have known better. The viral video had fundamentally changed his experience as a Queen's Guard in ways both positive and troubling. The first change was immediate and obvious. Tourists recognized him. As Thomas took his position outside the palace gates on that bright Monday morning, he noticed people pointing and whispering, showing their phones to friends and family. Some approached the security barriers, holding signs that read, "We support you, guardsmen, and respect the guards." Others simply gave him thumbs up or mouthed words of encouragement. As they passed by, the attention was overwhelming. Thomas had joined the guards to serve with quiet dignity, not to become a celebrity. But there was no denying that his face was now recognizable to millions of people who had watched the incident video or seen his press conference. Standing at his post, maintaining the traditional stoic expression, now felt different, knowing that dozens of cameras were specifically focused on him rather than just the general pageantry of the palace. Peter Chen, standing at his usual position beside Thomas, whispered during a brief moment when no tourists were immediately nearby, "How are you holding up with all this attention?" "It's strange," Thomas admitted quietly, his lips barely moving. "I feel like I'm in a fishbowl. Everyone's watching, specifically to see if something else dramatic will happen. At least the harassment has dropped significantly," Peter observed. "I've noticed tourists are being much more respectful since your video went viral." Peter was right. The behavior of visitors to Buckingham Palace had noticeably improved in the days since the incident. People maintained proper distance from the guards, spoke in respectful tones, and discouraged others from crossing boundaries. It seemed the viral video had served as an unintended but effective public service announcement about how to properly interact with ceremonial guards. The palace had also implemented new measures. Additional signage had been erected explaining the role of the guards and requesting respectful behavior. Palace police presence had been increased at the gates, and officers were quick to intervene when tourists began acting inappropriately. The changes created a more dignified atmosphere that Thomas appreciated, even if the attention on him personally remained uncomfortable. Around noon, Thomas noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Emma Richardson, the young woman from the incident, was standing behind the security barrier with an older couple who appeared to be her parents. She caught Thomas's eye and smiled, then carefully approached one of the palace police officers and spoke to him briefly. The officer nodded and used his radio. And a few minutes later, Captain Morrison appeared in the courtyard. Thomas watched from his peripheral vision as Morrison spoke with Emma and her parents and gestured toward the guardhouse. The group followed him inside, and Thomas wondered what was happening. His curiosity was answered 30 minutes later when his relief arrived early, and he was told to report to Captain Morrison's office immediately. Inside the office, Emma stood with her parents, all three looking slightly nervous but excited. Morrison gestured for Thomas to enter. "Guardsman Whitmore, Miss Richardson and her family specifically requested to meet you properly and express their gratitude for your intervention last week." Thomas felt suddenly awkward. Aware that he was still in full ceremonial uniform, bearskin hat tucked under his arm, Emma stepped forward and extended her hand. "I'm Emma. I wanted to thank you properly for what you did, and to apologize if my actions caused you any trouble." Thomas shook her hand, impressed by her composure and maturity. "You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Richardson. You showed real courage standing up for what you believed was right. I'm just glad I was able to help when the situation became dangerous." Emma's father, a tall man with graying hair, also shook Thomas's hand. "My name is Robert Richardson. My son James is currently deployed with the army in Estonia. When Emma told us what happened, and that she'd tried to defend you because of her brother's service, we were incredibly proud of her. And when we saw how you protected her, we were grateful that someone like you is there. Emma's mother, a kind-faced woman with the same dark hair as her daughter, had tears in her eyes. You kept our daughter safe when she needed it. There aren't words adequate to express our gratitude. If those men had hurt her, she couldn't finish the sentence, but Thomas understood. Your daughter's instinct to defend others is something to be proud of, Thomas said. She reminds me why we serve. It's not about the ceremonies or the traditions themselves. It's about protecting people who have the courage to stand up for what's right. Captain Morrison, who had been observing the exchange quietly, spoke up. Miss Richardson, your brother James is with the 2nd Battalion, Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, correct? At Emma's nod, he continued. I've arranged for him to join us via video call. He's currently on duty, but his commanding officer agreed to allow a brief conversation. Morrison turned his laptop screen toward the group. And a moment later, a young man in British Army camouflage appeared on screen. He bore a clear resemblance to Emma, with the same dark hair and sharp features, though his face showed the weathering of someone who had spent significant time in challenging conditions. Emma. James Richardson's voice came through the computer speakers, warm with affection and concern. Mom, Dad, good to see you all. I heard about what happened at the palace. Are you okay, Em? Emma moved closer to the screen, her eyes bright. I'm fine, James. I wanted you to meet the guard who protected me. This is Guardsman Whitmore. James's expression grew serious as he looked at Thomas through the screen. Guardsman Whitmore, I understand you intervened when my little sister was assaulted by some tourists. I'm grateful for your actions. Knowing she's safe while I'm out here makes it easier to focus on my job. Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the soldier's gratitude. Your sister showed the kind of courage and integrity that reminds us why we wear the uniform, Corporal Richardson. She deserves the credit here, not me. The video call lasted only a few more minutes, but the connection felt significant to Thomas. This wasn't just about a viral video or media attention. This was about the real purpose of service, protecting people, standing up for what's right, and being there when courage is needed. After the Richardson family left, Captain Morrison kept Thomas in his office. There's something else we need to discuss. The incident has created some opportunities that the palace and the Ministry of Defense want you to consider. Thomas sat down, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Morrison pulled up several documents on his computer. First, you've been recommended for a commendation for your actions. The palace wants to formally recognize your decision to protect a civilian. Second, the Army is launching a new public outreach program about the role of ceremonial guards, and they'd like you to be involved. It would mean traveling to schools, doing media appearances, representing the guards in public events. Thomas felt conflicted. Part of him was honored by the recognition, but another part worried about becoming a professional spokesman rather than an actual soldier. Sir, I appreciate the commendation, truly, but I'm not sure about the public outreach role. I joined the Guards to serve, not to be a celebrity. Morrison nodded understanding. I told them you'd probably feel that way. Here's the thing, Thomas. Whether you embrace it or not, you're already the public face of the Guards right now. That video has been viewed over 50 million times. You're being discussed in newspapers, on television, in classrooms around the world. You can either let that attention exist without direction, or you can use it to accomplish something meaningful. What do you mean? Thomas asked. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. Harassment of ceremonial guards has been a growing problem for years. We've documented thousands of incidents of tourists acting inappropriately, from minor annoyances to genuine assaults. Your video has created a moment where people are actually paying attention to this issue. If you participate in the outreach program, you could help create lasting change in how guards are treated. Isn't that worth considering? Thomas thought about all the times he'd stood at his post, enduring mockery and disrespect in silence. He thought about the other guards who dealt with the same treatment daily. If his unwanted fame could actually improve their working conditions and ensure they were treated with dignity, perhaps it was worth stepping out of his comfort zone. What would the outreach program involve specifically? Thomas asked. Morrison pulled up a schedule. School visits talking about military service and respect. Some media appearances discussing the role of the Guards. Participation in a documentary the BBC is producing about palace security. Nothing that would prevent you from performing your regular duties, but it would add responsibilities beyond your normal role.
No.
Thomas took a deep breath. Can I have some time to think about it? Of course. Take a week to consider. But Thomas, understand that this kind of opportunity doesn't come around often. You have a platform right now. The question is whether you want to use it. That evening, Thomas met with several of his fellow guardsmen at a pub near their barracks. Word had spread about the outreach program offer and opinions were divided. Some thought Thomas should embrace the opportunity to represent the Guards publicly. Others worried it would distract from actual military duties and create resentment among guardsmen who would serve longer without receiving similar recognition. Guardsman Michael Foster, a veteran with 12 years in the Guards, bought Thomas a pint and sat down across from him. You're dealing with something none of us have experienced, Foster said. Going viral, becoming famous overnight, it's surreal. But here's what I want you to know. What you did last week, that reminded everyone what we're really about. Before that video, people saw us as tourist attractions. Now they're remembering we're actual soldiers. That matters. But I'm just one guardsman, Thomas protested. There are hundreds of us, many with far more experience and accomplishments. Why should I be the one representing everyone? Foster smiled. Because you're the one who had the moment. You're the one people recognize. That's not about deserving it or earning it more than anyone else. It's just the reality of the situation. The question is what you do with it. Thomas spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. He spoke with his parents, who encouraged him to take the opportunity. He spoke with Peter Chin, who pointed out that the outreach program might actually be more interesting than standing still for hours at palace gates. He even received a letter from Emma Richardson, thanking him again and encouraging him to use his voice to make things better. On the 6th day after Morrison's offer, Thomas was standing ceremonial duty when something happened that made his decision crystal clear. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, approached the security barrier with his father. The boy was staring at Thomas with wide, awestruck eyes. "Dad," the boy whispered, though Thomas could still hear him. "Is that the guard from the video? The one who protected that girl?" The father checked his phone, comparing Thomas's face to images from the viral video. "I think it is, actually." The boy's face lit up with excitement. "He's a real hero. Can I talk to him?" The father hesitated, clearly aware of the protocol about not disturbing guards on duty. But Thomas, still maintaining his position, made a subtle nod toward the palace police officer nearby. The officer, having witnessed the interaction, approached the family. "Your son would like to speak with the guardsman?" the officer asked kindly. "He's a big fan," the father explained. "We've been teaching him about respect and courage, using that video as an example." The officer spoke briefly into his radio, and a moment later, Thomas's relief arrived early. The officer gestured for the family to approach, and Thomas stepped down from his post, his expression softening as he looked at the excited young boy. "Hello there," Thomas said, kneeling down to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "I'm Oliver," the boy said, his voice filled with awe. "You're really brave. I want to be like you when I grow up." What? Thomas felt something shift inside him. This child saw him as a hero, as an example of what courage and service looked like. If his actions could inspire even one young person to value respect, courage, and standing up for others, wasn't that worth any personal discomfort? "That's a wonderful goal, Oliver," Thomas said seriously. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. Can you remember that?" Oliver nodded solemnly. "I'll remember. Will you sign my notebook?" Thomas signed the boy's notebook, posed for a photo with the family, and watched them walk away, Oliver clutching his notebook like a precious treasure. In that moment, Thomas knew what his answer would be. The next morning, he reported to Captain Morrison's office and accepted the outreach program position. "I'll do it," Thomas said firmly. If my experience can help even one person understand the importance of respect and service, it's worth stepping out of my comfort zone. Morrison smiled with satisfaction. Good man. We'll start with the school visits next month. In the meantime, continue your regular duties. And Thomas, I'm proud of you. You've handled this entire situation with the dignity and grace that defines the Guards. As Thomas left the office and headed to his post, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond the ceremonial duties he'd been performing. He was still a Queen's Guard, still a protector of tradition and dignity. But now he had a broader mission: to use his unexpected platform to teach respect, encourage courage, and inspire the next generation to value service above self. The viral moment that had begun with harassment and ended with confrontation had transformed into something neither Thomas nor anyone else could have predicted, and he was determined to make the most of it. 6 months after the incident that made him internationally famous, Thomas Whitmore stood in front of 200 students at a comprehensive school in Birmingham, wearing his ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat. The auditorium was packed with teenagers who had been studying the role of the British military in modern society. And Thomas was there as part of the outreach program he'd agreed to join. The past half year had been a whirlwind of experiences Thomas never could have imagined when he first joined the Grenadier Guards. He'd visited dozens of schools across the United Kingdom, appeared on morning television programs, participated in that BBC documentary about palace security, and even given a presentation to members of Parliament about the challenges facing ceremonial guards. Through it all, he'd maintained his regular duties at Buckingham Palace, balancing his new, public role with the traditional responsibilities of a Queen's Guard. The transformation hadn't always been easy. Some fellow guardsmen resented the attention Thomas received, feeling that his fame overshadowed their own dedicated service. Others embraced it, recognizing that his visibility had genuinely improved working conditions for all ceremonial guards. The harassment at palace gates had decreased dramatically, and when inappropriate behavior did occur, palace security responded swiftly and decisively, now standing before these students. Thomas felt more comfortable with public speaking than he'd ever thought possible. He'd learned to share his story in a way that resonated with young people, focusing not on the viral fame but on the values that had motivated his actions: respect, courage, and the importance of standing up for others. I didn't react that day because I wanted attention or recognition, Thomas explained to the students. I reacted because someone who had shown courage by defending a stranger was being threatened for doing the right thing. That's a principle worth protecting, regardless of whether cameras are recording or not. A student raised her hand, and Thomas nodded for her to speak. Sir, do you ever regret that it became such a big deal? Like, would you have preferred if nobody had filmed it? Thomas considered the question carefully. That's complicated. Part of me wishes I could have just done my job without the media attention. But the reality is that the video created awareness about issues that needed addressing. Tourist behavior at the palace has improved. Schools are using the incident to teach about respect and appropriate conduct. If I had to choose between personal comfort and creating positive change, I'd choose the change every time. Another student, a young man in the back row, called out, "Did you get in trouble for breaking protocol?" Initially, my commanding officers had to investigate whether my actions were appropriate, Thomas answered honestly. In the military, we have rules and procedures that exist for good reasons. But those rules also have to account for situations where quick decisions are necessary. In this case, the investigation concluded that protecting a civilian from assault justified my departure from standard ceremonial protocols. The presentation continued for another 40 minutes, with Thomas explaining the history of the Guards, the training required to serve in ceremonial roles, and the broader purpose of military service. He showed videos of the changing of the Guard ceremony, explained the significance of various uniform elements, and discussed the balance between tradition and modern military responsibilities. After the presentation, the headmaster invited Thomas to join him for lunch with several teachers and administrators. Over sandwiches in the staff room, they discussed the impact of the school visits. "You're reaching these students in a way we never could," the headmaster said earnestly. They see you as authentic, as someone who lives the values we're trying to teach. The respect, the discipline, the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. Those lessons are far more effective coming from you than from a textbook or lecture. A history teacher added, "We've noticed that students who attend your presentations show increased interest in public service careers. Not just military service, but police, fire brigade, teaching, social work. You're inspiring them to think about how they can serve their communities." Thomas felt a sense of satisfaction hearing this feedback. The outreach program was accomplishing exactly what Captain Morrison had suggested it could, using his platform to create positive change and inspire the next generation. As he prepared to leave the school, Thomas was approached by a young student who had been sitting quietly in the back during the presentation. The boy looked nervous, holding a piece of paper in his hands. "Sir," the boy said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Thomas checked his watch and nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" The boy glanced around, making sure they had some privacy. "My name is David. I've been getting bullied at school because I want to join the military. Some of the other kids say it's stupid, that soldiers are just violent or whatever. But when I saw your video and then heard you speak today, it reminded me why I want to serve. You showed that military service is about protecting people and standing up for what's right." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was exactly the kind of impact he'd hoped to have. "David, anyone who criticizes your desire to serve doesn't understand what service means. The military isn't about violence. It's about having the courage and discipline to protect those who need protecting. Don't let anyone diminish that calling." David handed Thomas the piece of paper he'd been holding. It was a drawing, showing a guard in red uniform standing protectively in front of a young woman. With the words "Real heroes protect others" written at the bottom. "I drew this after watching your video," David explained. "I wanted to give it to you." Thomas accepted the drawing, genuinely moved. "This is incredible, David, thank you. I'm going to keep this as a reminder of why this outreach work matters." Driving back to London that afternoon, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in 6 months. The viral video that had initially felt like an invasion of privacy had become a catalyst for meaningful work. He was still a Queen's Guard, still performed ceremonial duties at Buckingham Palace. But now he also had a broader mission that extended beyond standing at gates. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma Richardson. "Saw your Birmingham school presentation on Twitter. You're amazing at this. My brother comes home from deployment next month and wants to meet you properly. Coffee." Thomas smiled and texted back his agreement. Emma had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood the strange experience of being thrust into viral fame. She'd also embraced her own platform, doing interviews about standing up to bullying and the importance of defending others. Together, they'd participated in several anti-bullying campaigns and school programs. When Thomas arrived back at the barracks that evening, he found Captain Morrison waiting for him with news. "Thomas, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. You've been selected for the Queen's Commendation for Bravery. The formal presentation will be next month at Buckingham Palace." Thomas felt stunned. The Queen's Commendation was a significant honor, recognizing actions that demonstrated bravery, but fell below the threshold for higher gallantry awards. "Sir, I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing," Morrison replied. "The work you've done over the past 6 months has been exemplary. You've represented the Guards with distinction. It's inspired countless young people and demonstrated that viral fame can be channeled into something meaningful. The commendation recognizes not just your actions that day at the palace, but everything you've accomplished since." The formal presentation ceremony took place on a crisp December morning. Thomas stood in the palace throne room, surrounded by other recipients of various honors and their families. His parents were there, his father wearing his old police uniform, his mother in her finest dress. Emma Richardson and her family attended as well, along with Peter Chen and several other guardsmen from Thomas's unit. When his name was called, Thomas marched forward with precise military bearing and stood at attention as the citation was read aloud. It detailed the incident at the palace gates, his intervention to protect a civilian, and his subsequent work promoting respect and public service through the outreach program. A senior royal official pinned the commendation to Thomas's uniform and shook his hand. Your actions and your service honor us all, Guardsman Whitmore. Well done. After the ceremony, there was a reception where recipients and their guests could mingle. Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers, but he noticed Emma standing slightly apart, looking at something on her phone with a troubled expression. Thomas excused himself and approached her. "Everything okay?" Emma looked up, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Remember those tourists? The ones from the incident?" "Hard to forget them," Thomas said. "I know they were convicted of assault and harassment charges." "What about them?" Emma turned her phone screen toward Thomas. It showed a news article with the headline, "American Tourist Banned from UK After Viral Palace Assault." The article detailed how the blonde man who had shoved Emma, identified as Chase Morrison, no relation to Captain Morrison, had been sentenced to community service and a 5-year ban from entering the United Kingdom. "Good," Thomas said firmly. "Actions have consequences. Maybe being banned from the UK will make him think twice before harassing people in the future." Emma nodded, but her expression was thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if we made too big a deal out of it? Like he shoved me, which was wrong. But now his life is significantly affected. Is that fair?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Emma, he didn't just shove you. He and his friends spent an hour deliberately harassing a guard who couldn't respond. They mocked, they intimidated, and when someone stood up to them, they became physically aggressive. They recorded all of it, planning to share it for entertainment. Those weren't the actions of someone who made a momentary mistake. Those were the actions of someone who believed they were entitled to treat others disrespectfully without consequences." "You're right," Emma agreed. "I guess part of me still feels guilty that our incident caused such a huge reaction." "Don't," Thomas said gently. "The reaction wasn't because of us. It was because countless people recognized behavior they'd seen or experienced themselves. Guards who'd been harassed for years finally saw someone face consequences. Victims of bullying saw someone stand up to bullies. Young people saw an example of courage being rewarded instead of punished. We didn't create that reaction. We just provided a moment that crystallized feelings that were already there." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma's brother James. Home from deployment and wearing his army dress uniform, he approached Thomas with a broad smile and extended his hand. "Guardsman Whitmore. We met briefly via video call, but I wanted to thank you in person for protecting my sister." Thomas shook his hand warmly. "Corporal Richardson, your sister's courage that day reflected well on your family. She's someone to be very proud of." James put his arm around Emma's shoulders. "I've always been proud of her. But knowing she stood up for what was right, even when it was scary, that's next level. She told me you said something about that being why we serve." "You were right." The three of them spent the next hour talking about military service, the challenges of modern deployments, and the unexpected ways that courage manifests in civilian life. Thomas felt a sense of connection with James Richardson, fellow soldier who understood the complexities of service and sacrifice. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, Thomas took a moment alone in one of the palace corridors. He held the drawing young David had given him at the Birmingham school. Looking at the simple but powerful image of a guard protecting someone in need, 6 months ago, Thomas had been a relatively anonymous ceremonial guard, performing his duties with quiet dedication but no particular recognition. A single moment of choosing to act rather than remain passive had transformed his life completely. He'd become famous, faced media scrutiny, struggled with unwanted attention, and ultimately found a way to channel that experience into something meaningful. The viral video would eventually fade from public consciousness, replaced by newer stories and different viral moments. But the changes it had sparked would endure. Tourists at Buckingham Palace were more respectful. Schools were teaching lessons about courage and standing up for others. Young people like David were being inspired to consider lives of service. And Thomas had learned something crucial about himself: that sometimes the most important moments in life come when you choose to break from protocol, to act on principle rather than comfort, to protect those who need protecting even when it's inconvenient or complicated. His phone buzzed with a message from Captain Morrison. "Congratulations again on the commendation. Report for duty tomorrow at 0800. We've got a new group of tourists to not react to. Try not to make any more viral videos. Thomas smiled at the gentle joke and sent back a simple response. I'll do my best, sir. But no promises if someone needs defending. Walking out of Buckingham Palace into the London evening, Thomas felt a sense of peace that had been elusive in the chaotic months since the incident. He'd found a way to balance his ceremonial duties with his new role as a public figure. He'd used his unwanted fame to create positive change. He'd proven to himself and others that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, was always the correct choice. The ceremonial red tunic and bearskin hat he wore weren't just costumes for tourists to photograph. They were symbols of service, tradition, and the willingness to protect those who needed protecting. Thomas had honored those symbols through his actions that day at the palace gates, and he would continue to honor them every day going forward. As he headed back to the barracks, Thomas passed a group of tourists taking photos of the illuminated palace. They saw him in his uniform and immediately grew respectful. One parent gently reminding her children to step back and not disturb the guard. Thomas allowed himself the smallest smile, invisible to the observers. The viral moment had passed, but its impact endured. Respect had been restored, lessons had been learned, and one rookie guard who thought his intervention would be a minor footnote had instead sparked a conversation that reached around the world. Thomas Whitmore had gone viral at Buckingham Palace, and in doing so, had reminded everyone of a simple but profound truth: that courage, respect, and standing up for others never go out of style. No matter how many times the story gets retold or reshared, the enemy in this case wasn't a foreign power or military threat. It was disrespect, entitlement, and the belief that some people were props rather than persons. And by midnight of that viral day, those enemies had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget: that behind every ceremonial uniform stands a real soldier, ready to defend what matters, regardless of the personal cost. Thomas's reaction had indeed gone viral, but more importantly, his values had gone viral too, and that made all the difference.